In December 1940, Winston Churchill sat in his underground bunker in London and stared at a ledger that spelled the end of the British Empire. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air, but the Battle of the Bank had been lost, and the United Kingdom was financially bankrupt. Great Britain had spent its entire gold reserve, liquidated its foreign investments, and shipped its national wealth to Canada to pay for the war. They had run out of dollars, and in the world of 1940, if you couldn't pay American manufacturers in cash, you didn't get weapons. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a political nightmare, trapped between a desperate ally and an isolationist American public. American laws explicitly forbade giving credit to nations that had defaulted on their World War I debts, which technically included Britain. Roosevelt needed a legal loophole to bypass Congress and the accountants, a way to fight a war without declaring one. On December 17, 1940, he held a press conference and introduced a simple, folksy metaphor that would change the course of history. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose. I don't say to him, 'Neighbor, my hose cost me $15. I say, 'Here is the garden hose, put out the fire, and give me the hose back when you are finished.'" This was the birth of the Lend-Lease Act, historically numbered H.R. 1776, a symbolic nod to the year of American independence. It was a masterstroke of political marketing that allowed the U.S. to become the arsenal of democracy without technically entering the fight. But behind the folksy metaphor lay the most massive, complex, and expensive logistical operation in the history of human warfare. The program would eventually cost $50 billion in 1940s currency, which equates to nearly $700 billion in today's money. This video is an audit of that $50 billion bill, analyzing exactly what was sent, how it got there, and who actually paid for it. We will look at the aluminum that built the Red Air Force, the trucks that carried the Red Army, and the debts that took 60 years to repay. To understand the scale of Lend-Lease, we must first look at the industrial vacuum that existed in Great Britain in 1941. Britain could build fighters and bombers, but they could not feed their own population while their sea lanes were being strangled by U-boats. The first shipments weren't just tanks, they were millions of tons of dried egg powder, cheese, and the famous canned meat, Spam. Food logistics was the immediate priority, as a starving workforce cannot build ships, and a hungry soldier cannot hold a rifle. By the end of the war, the United States had shipped enough food to Britain to provide every single citizen with 20% of their daily calorie intake. But the most critical commodity wasn't food, it was oil, specifically 100-octane aviation fuel, which the British refineries couldn't produce in volume. Without American high-octane fuel, the Spitfires and Hurricanes would have flown slower, diminishing their edge against the German Luftwaffe. Lend-Lease effectively outsourced the energy needs of the British war machine to the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma. However, the story of Lend-Lease takes a dramatic turn in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the United States had to supply not just a democratic ally, but a communist regime that they didn't trust. The logistics of supplying Russia were a nightmare, involving three main routes: the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Persian corridor. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk are the most famous, sailing through freezing storms and Nazi submarine wolf packs. These convoys were a suicide run, exemplified by the disaster of convoy PQ-17, which lost 24 out of 35 merchant ships. Because of the danger, the Allies developed the Persian corridor, a massive engineering project to rebuild the railways of Iran. American engineers laid tracks across deserts and mountains to create a backdoor into the Soviet Union, safe from German torpedoes. Through this corridor flowed the most important item of the entire Lend-Lease program for Russia, the Studebaker US-6 truck. While popular history focuses on tanks, the Red Army was actually mechanized by American trucks, receiving over 400,000 of them. Before Lend-Lease, the Soviet logistics relied on horses and rudimentary railroads that couldn't keep up with the panzer divisions. The Studebaker trucks allowed the Soviets to employ deep battle tactics, moving artillery and infantry hundreds of miles in days. Even the famous Katyusha rocket launchers, the icons of Soviet artillery power, were almost exclusively mounted on American truck chassis. Stalin himself, in a rare moment of honesty at the Tehran conference, proposed a toast to American manufacturing. He admitted, "Without American production, the United Nations could never have won the war. Let's audit the aircraft." The US sent 14,000 airplanes to the Soviet Union, including the Bell P-39 Airacobra. The P-39 was hated by American and British pilots because it lacked a turbocharger, making it useless at high altitudes. But on the Eastern Front, the air war was fought at low altitudes, where the P-39's massive 37mm nose cannon was a devastating tank killer. Soviet aces loved the plane, proving that a weapon considered a failure in one theater can be a game-changer in another. Beyond finished machines, the US sent raw materials that were arguably more critical than the weapons themselves. The Soviet Union had lost its aluminum plants in the West during the initial German invasion. The US shipped over 300,000 tons of aluminum to Russia, enough to build tens of thousands of T-34 tank engines and aircraft. Without this aluminum, the Soviet production miracle of 1942 and 1943 would have been mathematically impossible. Then there was the issue of boots. The US Army supplied 15 million pairs of leather boots to the Red Army. A common saying among Russian soldiers was that they marched to Berlin on American leather. But Lend-Lease wasn't a one-way street. There was a concept called reverse Lend-Lease that is often forgotten. The Allies provided the US with bases, intelligence, and critical technologies that American scientists hadn't yet mastered. The most valuable item the US received was the Cavity Magnetron, a British invention that made portable radar possible. This single device was estimated to be worth more than the entire cost of the supplies sent to Britain. It allowed the US to leapfrog years of research, miniaturizing radar sets to fit into night fighters and bomber noses. So while the US paid in steel and gold, the British paid in intellectual property and strategic geography. Now, let's look at the business case of Lend-Lease. Was it an act of charity or a calculated investment? Roosevelt sold it as a defense of the United States, arguing that it was cheaper to pay others to fight than to fight yourself. By arming the Soviets and the British, the US kept the Wehrmacht occupied, buying time to build its own army. Every German tank destroyed by a Lend-Lease shell was one less tank that American soldiers would have to face on D-Day. The economic impact on the US was transformative, effectively ending the Great Depression overnight. Factories that had been idle for a decade were suddenly running 3 shifts a day, funded by government contracts. Lend-Lease was the stimulus package that built the modern American military-industrial complex. It created the infrastructure for companies like Ford, GM, and Boeing to dominate the post-war global economy. But there was a sting in the tail: the consideration, or how the bill would eventually be paid. The agreement stated that equipment destroyed in combat would be written off, but civilian supplies had to be paid for. This created a massive post-war debt for Great Britain, a financial burden that would shape its economy for decades. The US also demanded the dismantling of the British Imperial preference trade system as part of the deal. Effectively, the US used Lend-Lease to pry open the protected markets of the British Empire for American exporters. It was a ruthless geopolitical maneuver: save the ally, but dismantle their economic monopoly in the process. For the Soviet Union, the payment negotiations were far more hostile and dragged on into the Cold War. The US demanded payment for the civilian inventory left over, like trucks and locomotives, totaling billions. Stalin refused to pay, arguing that the Soviet Union had paid in blood, sacrificing 27 million lives. The debt remained a diplomatic weapon for decades, only being partially settled in the 1970s and finally in 2006. Britain, the closest ally, made its final Lend-Lease payment to the United States on December 29, 2006. It took the UK 61 years to pay off the debt incurred to fight a war for survival. This long repayment schedule underscores the massive scale of the transfer. It was a mortgage on the future of a nation. There was also a cultural impact. American products flooded the world, creating a taste for US brands. Coca-Cola, Spam, and American cigarettes became global commodities, riding on the back of the logistics network. Lend-Lease exported American culture as efficiently as it exported American high explosives. However, the program ended with a brutal shock on August 21, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. President Truman, following the strict letter of the law, ordered the immediate cessation of all shipments. Ships that were halfway across the Atlantic were ordered to turn around and bring the cargo back to the US. Britain, whose economy was still completely dependent on these shipments, was plunged into an immediate financial crisis. This sudden stop forced Britain to negotiate a new, less favorable loan just to keep the lights on. It demonstrated that while the US was a generous arsenal during the war, it was a strict banker in peace. We must also analyze the quality control issues that plagued the early shipments. Early American tanks sent to North Africa, like the M3 Lee, were considered inferior to British needs. But the sheer quantity overwhelmed the quality issues. Logistics has a quality all its own. If you send 5,000 medium tanks, it doesn't matter if they are slightly worse than the enemy's if he only has 500. The Sherman tank, often criticized, was the ultimate Lend-Lease vehicle because it was reliable and easy to ship. The British modified it into the Firefly, mounting their powerful 17-pounder gun on the American chassis. This hybrid vehicle is the perfect symbol of the alliance. American mass production married to British specialized engineering. Without the American chassis, the British gun had no mobility. Without the British gun, the chassis couldn't kill Tigers. Lend-Lease also extended to China, where the Flying Tigers flew American P-40s to keep the Japanese occupied. Supplying China was the hardest logistical challenge, requiring flights over the Hump of the Himalayas. Pilots risked their lives flying C-46 transports over the world's highest mountains to deliver gasoline and bullets. The cost of delivering 1 gallon of fuel to China was estimated to be 4 gallons of fuel burned by the delivery plane. But strategically, keeping China in the war tied down 1 million Japanese soldiers who could have fought elsewhere. It was an equation of efficiency versus strategic necessity, where necessity always won. The legacy of Lend-Lease forces us to rethink the narrative of World War II. It wasn't just won by the bravery of soldiers or the brilliance of generals. It was won by the accountants who managed the flow of $50 billion worth of assets. It was won by the merchant marines who died in the freezing waters of the Arctic to deliver aluminum. It was won by the factory workers in Detroit who built trucks for an army they would never see. Hitler and the Axis powers simply could not compete with an enemy that could outsource its supply chain. Germany had to conquer territory to get resources. The Allies just had to sign a check. The Lend-Lease Act turned the economic might of the US into a weapon that could be fired by anyone, anywhere. It proved that in a global industrial war, the nation with the deepest pockets and the biggest factories dictates the outcome. The $50 billion bill was high, but the cost of not paying it would have been a world ruled by fascism. Ultimately, Lend-Lease was the moment the United States bought its status as a superpower. By the time the books were balanced, the British Empire was in debt, Europe was in ruins, and the dollar was king. The garden hose was returned, as Roosevelt promised, but the neighborhood had changed forever. The fire was out, but the owner of the hose now owned the street. So when we look at the victory of 1945, we should see it not just as a military triumph. It was the greatest hostile takeover in history, funded by the American taxpayer.